It's time, Wolf, for the last Monte and Wolf show of the year of 2023. It's the end
Very
of
sad.
August. We didn't have a show last week, guys, because Wolf was still out and about at the actual venue for the finals, and we said we're going to wait until we got to the regional results so we could talk about all the teams going to Worlds. So here we are. Here we are. How was
Yeah.
finals? How was your finals experience?
Well, I mean, it was a bit of a roller coaster of a playoffs and finals weekend, and for more reasons than one. Part of it being the KT roller coaster, which we were all riding quite significantly throughout that event. The finals sucked. The KT versus T1 match was pretty fun. The previous KT versus T1 match was pretty fun. The Gen.G T1 match that happened before the finals was messy. And one of those two teams walked out of that best of five learning something and improving a lot. The other team was still kind of stuck in the past. We had a pretty terrible finals, but we had a pretty fun lead up to the finals in most of those games. KT versus T1, both of those series were really fun. Gen.G versus T1 was not as fun, was definitely messier than the series, the rest of the best of fives that went to five. But T1, they were pretty hampered by Faker's champion pool, which was a problem that we saw with Zeka as well. I feel like I can't remember a time in recent history where mid champion pool was such a problem for the LCK, but here we are.
I think what was so crazy to me, Wolf, is that when we saw the second T1 versus KT match in the losers bracket, we didn't see the same bands that we saw from Gen.G, which were Azir, Nico, and Xayah. It seems really obvious that these are the bands that you try and dish out against T1. So I don't understand why KT is. Maybe they just were cocky because BDD did well in lane in the first series that they played, and that really wasn't the reason why KT lost. That they thought, oh, it's fine, we can just have Faker have the Azir and the Nico over and over and over again. But it was really bizarre that that's what they came in with their strategy, and it seemed like, the game where they didn't let Faker have Nico and Azir, he was just pretty terrible on Cassiopeia, and they should have just continued to roll with a strategy that forced him off those two picks.
It may have come across on the cast a little bit, but after game two, I was so angry in between game two and game three. I was like yelling at the other casters, like, why are they letting Faker play Azir every game? Like, how are they allowing this to happen? And then they tried to play through picking Faker over and over and over again after it didn't work in game one. Then they tried again in game two. And even with Faker's injured hands, the one thing he's going to do is slip out of a sticky situation and his team's going to turn on the play. That's what Faker's done for like the last 2 years all the time on this pick. And Azir is one of those champions you can escape from a million miles away on, and then of course, or escape to a million miles away, and also you have your Emperor's Divide. So it's really difficult to actually to pick Faker and to try to kill him in these types of scenarios. And yet they let him keep having it. And even though he played Nico pretty well in terms of team fight engage, he also was a primary reason why I think some of those games that KT won were won, because he overforced on that top side play, for example, I think in game four, and really just didn't have a consistent performance in general. And Faker looked very weak in this series, but they didn't punish him until they went into that game three. And if they hadn't have, I think it might have been a 3-0, to be totally honest, if they just let him have a 0 again in that third game. Guma also super reliant on Xayah. They didn't take that away. And it just felt like, where's the confidence? Where's the planning here, KT? Like, it felt like overall a very weak series for them, where they didn't have a strong strategy. They just came in saying, we're better. And then they put Lehens at level 1. Let's all in. Like, they did the same thing they did in the last series, which didn't work. And like, Lehens lost his confidence in this series as well. Didn't play very well. Overextended a lot. He had his own good moments, right? He had some good engages in team fights, but he was, I feel like, 40% of the Lehens we saw in regular season when KT was dominant and in first place. And it was really just kind of an embarrassing series for KT overall, even though it went to 5.
I mean, they almost lost game 4 because of Lehens, again, like you say, just trying to run it down level 1. It was just really baffling to me, the parallels that we saw KT really being so cavalier in the early game, not having enough. Like, I think they were surprised by the 8 support bans in game number 1, so we just ended up with a totally useless Singe that felt like a panic pick almost. So I was just really disappointed in KT this series. Although I will say they did clean it up. They looked a lot better in the regional qualifiers. They were able to actually secure their world slot, which it's disappointing that they couldn't actually give a good finals against Gen.G, because I think that would have been a more compelling series. But they couldn't overcome T1, and I'm not sure what it was about these 2 best of 5s, but they just felt kind of like they were losing to themselves a lot of the time.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I feel like KT, we see teams fall into this trap sometimes. We've seen T1 do it a little bit, but generally not as bad as this. But a lot of the time when a team goes on a first place run and they're as dominant as KT was, they just kind of forget why they were good and just go, oh, we're just better than everybody else, and like really hard force and try to get massive early game advantages. I feel like KT's kill differential in all of their games throughout the regular season, especially in round 2, it was like massive disparities. Even if the early game was kind of like, all right, we went 3-1 or 3-2 in the early game, they would just keep pushing their advantages so well and finish the game at like 17-4. You know, and it was this insane stomps. Like a lot of KT's games were absolute stomps, and they did have some games where they came back. Right, there were a few throughout the season, but against most of the regular season teams that were significantly worse than them, they didn't have to be tested in draft. They didn't have to be tested in what happens if early game goes badly against a good team. Like they got tested a few times, right? But the second time they were playing against T1, T1 had Poby. The first time they were playing against Gen.G, there was the Shiv incident, right? The second time against Gen.G, they stomped them. Gen.G had a bad read on that series. So then they otherwise just kind of absolutely bopped every other team they played, and I feel like they didn't learn that much. And I don't know who they were scrimming with, but clearly the results were not very good, probably in retrospect. And like Dplus, I heard from Dplus that they were scrimming KT a lot and actually just stomping them in the lead up to this and in Worlds qualifiers. And we know obviously now Dplus had a very great run through the Worlds gauntlet, but KT just really fell off in a big way. And it's hard to quantify and explain because they just made bad choices. It's just almost as simple as that. And like I feel like we weren't wrong about our read on KT. We weren't wrong about our thoughts on what KT at their best could have done. It just didn't happen. They just didn't show up.
Yeah, I don't really understand what possessed them to take all of these like risks in the early game. In the first series, just like continuously pick Renekton, and then not have an answer to Zeus's champion pool, which you knew he had, and then Zeus has a great series. And in this one, it's like, just don't give Faker the tools that he needs to succeed. He's not that good right now. He's not.
Yeah.
We saw that in the final. Chovy bopped him.
I mean, Azir is one of those picks that I feel like you can play when you're significantly worse mid than your opposition, because Azir doesn't interact with the enemy champions directly. Like he interacts via his sand soldiers, so you can just put the sand soldiers down and play around that. And if you're smart and you have bad hands, you should be able to like do fine in most cases. And then obviously, if you're a top level Azir, I think you can get huge lane prio. You can actually put a lot of pressure on. But Faker is like the most storied Azir player of all time, so he has absolutely the understanding of how far he can push those limits, how far he can push into the lane when, you know, BDD is roaming. Like, can he grab that plate and then skate his way out, as he did many times throughout playoffs? And it just felt super obvious to me, based on how T1 was drafting every time, where they were often first picking Azir or grabbing it in that first rotation, saying, we have to make sure Faker is on this. And like, to me, watching it, it felt so obvious that they are reliant on this pick, but it seemed like the rest of the teams in playoffs didn't realize it until much later. Gen.G, they definitely knew after watching the KT series. They were like, well, if we just take this away, take away the Nico, and then Guma can't play Xayah, it's a little bit tougher for T1 to get these wins because they are so reliant on those 3 picks. Zeus, on the other hand, you don't want to ban this guy out because obviously he's got a massive champion ocean. He's not going to have problems. He's got really strong picks on this meta. The Aatrox he was somewhat reliant on, but he did it very well. He did it blind. And then Carry obviously is a player who can play a plethora of engage and disengage support, so much harder to target him. I like the strategy of T1 banning all the supports that they did against KT. It felt like they had a good read that Lehen's he wants to go in no matter what, and he can't help
Yes.
himself right now in this meta. So just take away all of his opportunity to do that, because Lehens has fantastic hands, and he will absolutely pop off if he gets the advantage. But if he doesn't have the champs or the tools to do that, like Singed, for example, he looks a lot weaker.
Yeah. Yeah. Or you just play Lulu into him and, he can't do much anymore. And you also just are able to very effectively bully aiming when he's playing the Zeri in the laning phase. I mean, I think T1, to their credit, had a very good plan for how to deal with KT, to your point. But and it just felt the exact opposite way when we got to the final, where Gen.G was clearly extremely ready for everything that T1 could throw at them. They stuck to these Azir, Nico, Xayah bans that we said were critically important, and then just knew what they were going to pick and had all of the answers. It's like, yes, we will bring back the Silas once again. Sure, we'll bring back Cassante mid. So it's just kind of like Chovy's greatest hits from the last year of League of Legends play. And even Pays, who had not played Neela before, when that's really been a Gumi Yushi pick, had the Neela for the bot lane. And even though that was a tough game that T1 arguably could have won, Gen.G's composition was just this massive AoE CC Wombo combo that made it very difficult for T1 to play out any kind of win condition in the mid game, because any grouping was just going to be dominated by Gen.G.
If you look at the drafts as well from Gen.G, Peanut played Sejuani twice, I believe, and Pays played Zeri twice, and Delight played Rakan twice, but otherwise, everyone played different stuff every game. Like, all three drafts were completely different. They were all great answers to what T1 put out. They were super prepared for this finals, and we were having the discussion before the finals, like, is the advantage of having winner's bracket enough versus, the teams that play on that stage the day before have played in front of the crowd, they've warmed up, they're familiar with the stage setup, and I generally lean towards extra prep is way more important. But the turnaround time from going to the end of that best of 5 with KT-T1 into the next day is extremely hard for T1, obviously, but there's not that much that goes into the timing for prep, and you can't scrim between those games. It's not going to be like, oh, let me try a new strategy. You have to be prepared and ready with strategies, and then you can alter your plan, but you won't have a lot of time to play 5 games of Camille if you're Doran to get back into the vibe of what playing Camille is like. But clearly Gen.G proved that if you have the extra time, and T1 played several long best of 5 series where you got a ton of data on Faker, especially, which I think they used to great effect, it does really give you such a huge advantage if you have a robust coaching staff. And I think the time that KT had, for example, and the time that Hanwha had, we'll get into that in a minute, before Worlds qualifiers, was just not utilized correctly. Gen.G absolutely, with Score and the coaching staff there, used it to great effect. And we saw Talia from
What are you
Chovy.
talking about? KT #1 coaching staff of the split.
No, Monty, no. No, Monty, no. I wasn't even there the whole time. But I love Eli, by the way, and I do think he's a great coach. But I also will tell you guys, I don't vote for Coach of the Year. I didn't vote for Coach of the Year. I don't know enough about it. But anyways, Chovy's impact on the Talia, fantastic. His Cassante game into Talia was very good. His laning phase, he just walked up to Talia on Cassante and just got in Faker's face and beat him in lane. And then they fell behind, but then he made the clutch play to get the flash Q3 knock-up in that fight, I believe, around the Baron towards the end of the game. And then and Guma died. And that was a very sad and awkward moment. And I mean, during the finals, we wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, because Faker was there with the Weaver's Wall right as he got picked, and he is Xayah. He does have his ultimate. We're like, okay, maybe they were trying to bait something there because they lost control of the map, but in all likelihood, he most likely got picked. And Guma's map awareness is not his strong point. So that was kind of a tragic,
that is a true statement.
it was kind of tragic in that it felt like that game was close enough to where maybe T1 could shift some momentum and make it an interesting series. But then no, it didn't happen, and it was a very boring finals, as the last few T1 Gen.G finals have all been.
And the third Gen.G title in a row now. In spite of the fact that I think they were favorites in 2 of them. I guess they were favored last summer and this summer, underdogs in the spring. still managed to win all three, these last three. And I think for me, I'm really glad T1 bounced back, even though we've been kind of negative about T1 and positive about KT. You know, T1 did pull off the win, and I think they did have a really strong game plan coming in against KT. It's just that KT failed to adapt and was playing quite strangely compared to what we had seen during the regular season. But at least we got a good playoffs. There was always going to be a concern that Faker coming back after this injury, he was not going to be up to snuff. And yeah, he didn't have his best playoffs. He lost lane a lot to BDD and Chovy, but his shot calling was evident. The rest of his team stepped up. You know, for the most part, Gumayushi and Zeus and Keria were all quite good. Owner was he was okay. He had some up and
his
down
bad
moments.
moments and his okay moments. Like there were not very many great moments, unfortunately, but they weren't able to punish him as well as they wanted to. So you know, it wasn't as important that he was looking a little bit off, and he has kind of looked off throughout playoffs and the end of regular season as well, a little bit shaky. But we'll see if he can bring it back for Worlds. But I just felt like if Faker was on point and again could use the champion pool that we know he has, maybe this would have been a different scenario. Yeah. And I think this season will kind of always be remembered as the season that Faker got injured, because obviously without him the team couldn't do anything, and with him they did as much as they could, but like he was very clearly limited, right? And they still made the finals, which is a cool and incredible story in itself, which is why from a narrative perspective and from obviously Game 5 perspective into a massive crowd and Daejeon perspective, like that T1 KT series was so awesome because T1 were very much the underdogs. KT did kind of drop the ball, but it was a 5-game series, and there was like the, oh, Faker, he's back, and like he's making it happen. They keep trying to kill him and they can't catch him. Kind of storyline there, and then obviously Guma clutching it out / KT running it down in the final game, which was a crazy 5th and final game.
Yeah, it was a wild game.
That was a really fun cast. That was definitely one of my like favorite League of Legends series I've cast thus far. Even though I think if you look at like was it the greatest level of play? Like was it the highest level of League of Legends? No, I think it definitely was not. But in terms of the stakes, I thought it was really, really fun to be a part of. The crowd was amazing. Viewership was amazing. I was really happy with how that all went down. And then, you know, the finals, at least the opening ceremony, just on that note, the opening ceremony was really cool. I really liked like Gen.G kind of standing there to defend their title and T1 walking out to try to take it.
Also, the hype video was really good this time.
I thought that the LCK the last few years has sometimes tried to go a little bit too over the top or a little bit too like bizarre, but this one just felt like simple but nice, you know?
Yeah,
very basic,
good.
And I really, really enjoyed it. Caster John nailed it as always. And yeah, it was a very, very good finals production. There were no tech issues as well, which we've had a few times over the last few finals. So bad games, but like very good. And Monte, I think it's time to say that we're living in the era of Gen.G. Like this is a Gen.G era. They've won these last 3 titles, and despite not getting first place in regular season, they were very close. They were very dominant, and in these peak series, even when people doubt them, even when they're not the favorites, they just keep clutching it out. Like this is a strong best of 5 team. So what's going to happen with them at Worlds? Will they actually just not choke at Worlds? Will they actually do a good job at Worlds? I'm optimistic. I'm a little optimistic.
Will Chovy turn back into Hanwha Chovy like he did last year instead of being Gen.G Chovy, which is one of the weirdest regressions I've ever seen, where it's like, Chovy, you spent the last 2 years like learning about map awareness and how to macro, and then he just forgot all of that, and he turned back into a pumpkin, which was very, very strange. Very strange. At last Worlds, but they're going to be in Korea this time. Perhaps it'll be a little bit more comfortable. They won't be on the road the entire time.
Yeah, he's Chovy's also going to be playing in Asia Games, so we'll see how he does there. I think that could be an extra confidence boost if that roster does well. It's hard to say at this point in time how all that's going to go down, because Asia Games is a weird and mysterious tournament with like very strange rules, and everything's like best of 3. And
Is there going to be an English cast for that, Wolf?
We don't know. I have reached out. I haven't gotten a response. I really hope so. I think there will be. Is it going to be us? I don't know. I would really love to do it, but I just have no idea. So
But you won't
it's
be able to
coming up.
say blood or kills.
I don't know what's going on with that. I can tell you two things though. A, I don't think the English cast will have that restriction, and if B, they try to hire me with those stipulations, I will refuse to do it. So I won't be saying first point and second point and triple point instead of triple kill. That won't be me. It's not going to be how I do that.
It's too funny that they might actually mandate that the casters speak in that way. But I guess we'll have to wait and see if it happens. Also, speaking of things that were said or will be said, can you explain to me why Peanut was introduced by Caster Jun as Nut God Peanut?
So he's gotten the nickname in Korea God Nut. Like
Okay.
you know
Yes.
how you
Yeah.
say
Yeah.
God, but it sounds like God
Yeah.
God Nut.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whoever decided to translate that, I believe that's what Caster Jun said. I don't know, but of course my eyes were very much like drawn to the subtitle that said Nut God. And there was just a moment because we didn't see this in rehearsal, and there's a moment where we were watching the opening, and then me, Valdez, and the Chronicler just looked at each other. We were like, "That one just probably should have like gotten a second look in QA." You know, probably should have. That one probably shouldn't have made it through. But who knows? You know, I don't know what he does in his personal life, but like. He was obviously we call him the golden nut sometimes locally at the LCK broadcast. The one true nut. He's got a lot of great nicknames.
Oh man, that was too funny. Well, I'm tentatively excited to see Gen.G at the World Championship. I'm glad KT managed to just kind of sweep their way on through the regional qualifiers. I'm glad we're going to see T1. I'm really hopeful that this break is going to allow Faker's arm to heal a little bit, even though he is participating in the Asian games. He's probably not going to be actually playing. He might play a game or two, but I think for the most part, he'll be recovering and resting. And also, I mean, you just would rather have Chovy playing in the important matches right now, I think.
Yeah, there's not a lot of like really. I mean, they probably do exist, but they're not. You know, I haven't looked fully into them, but I'm guessing that if you're on the roster, you still get military exemption even
Right.
if you don't play. But if there is some stipulation I've missed, because again, like I said, I think that is the case where if you're on the bench, you still get it. He'll probably play like whatever games are required, and that's going to be it. But I think the requirement is 0. But I'm not 100% sure about that. But yeah, I think he will mostly just be supporting the team. And I think a lot of the players that you could have on a roster like this who would sit on the bench won't be useful at all, you know, in terms of sharing information. Like you got a lot of top tier players who overall just defer to what the coaches tell them to do, and they just are really strong mechanical players. Faker is actually a nice benefit to have on your team, at least because I think he looks at the game in a very
Yeah, he
intelligent
can
way,
help
obviously.
coach. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think he's gonna be huge, and they have Coma as a coach as well. So like Faker and Coma together should be able to make some cool stuff happen. They'll probably have a really good read on that, which could help some of these players before they go to Worlds as well. Maybe Chovy gets a little bit of extra practice on the patch in a really competitive setting. Of course, his rest of his team isn't all completely LCK with Kanavi and Ruler, but maybe they'll learn some stuff they can bring back to JDG, etc. as well. So I'm looking forward to Asian Games in terms of what it could potentially mean for military exemption, but otherwise, I just don't really look at it like it's a real high level tournament that should be taken very seriously. So, we'll see. Like it's a really cool Olympic event, but it's not the pinnacle of Asian League of Legends competition. We'll see that at Worlds.
Sure. Do you want to say a few words over Hanwha's corpse now that they are definitely removed after they spent all this money? Wolf, they bought Zeka and Kingen so high coming off the World Championship. They paid God knows how much money to Viper to be on this roster, and it was just a trash can. Obviously, Clid even before was not helping, but especially after the scandal, thrust Grizzly, who I think it was good to mention, as you did on the cast in the regional qualifier, that this is a guy who is kind of like thrust into this position and probably wasn't ready for it. But at the end of the day, once we got into best of fives, because of the way that Hanwha played, he was really quite easy to exploit in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, his Viego he was super relied on, but he didn't have the great Viego gameplay that we've seen from him in the past. I mean, like he got those early 2 kills in game 3, I believe it was, game 4, I believe it was, because Hanwha actually stole game 1. They should have lost that game as well. But anyway, he looked a little bit exposed in terms of champion pool, but again, early days in this guy's career. I do think he has a lot of potential. I think we've talked about this on the show a few times. Like I think he definitely could be a really good player in the future. He kind of felt like a Willer type to me, where Willer was a little bit weaker when Hanwha qualified back in 2021, but really helped Chovy and was Chovy's bodyguard and was able to come through. This is a little bit different, obviously. Willer had almost no real experience in those high stakes best of fives. He kind of showed up though. Grizzly, on the other hand, didn't really and made a lot of mistakes, reminiscent of Klid's mistakes, where he would just get picked right before these big objectives. I don't know if that has anything to do with the shot calling on Hanwha or not, because it was really reminiscent of how Klid was getting picked. So hard to say, but I just think he was really new, so it's hard to blame him. But you can, however, blame Hanwha for not doing any draft adaptation whatsoever since playoffs started at all. They drafted the exact same way every time, and then when Sejuani was banned every game, Zeka was like, well, I can't play Yone now. And then Azir has always been like middle to, when he's on, like high, but it averages around pretty middling for me.
Yep.
Zeka's Azir. I think his Worlds performance last year was kind of shocking because he played very well on the Azir, but otherwise just, was pretty mediocre in LCK, like just to contextualize, as DRX were, right? But the Akali he picked in that series against Dplus was like, it was in my mind a terrible pick, made absolutely no sense, even though it's counter pick.
Well, especially if you're picking it into like Rel, Cassante, and Lulu.
Yeah,
like that's really hard to play Akali into.
It was pretty desperate, and like that's the kind of player that Zeka has been for a lot of his career. And when Akali was in S tier pick in Worlds, it was like, all right, cool, yeah, I can play this one. This is awesome. This is amazing. When it's not, and they ban a lot of his champions away, and he picks Akali into Sylas, you're like, how much growth have we seen from you this year? Is like the question I have to ask, because going into playoffs, I was like, Zeka's improved a lot. When he's on the champions, he's good at. He's doing a lot in lane. He's doing a lot in team fights. He's been pretty clutch. But then when he is forced into an awkward champion pool, it feels like I'm watching DRX again, especially with Kingen, who struggled a little bit in this series as well. He both won and lost that Aatrox game for his team by getting massively ahead and then running towards the enemy team when they weren't set up to do so. Like when they got that Baron and then he just ran at the team and died and the team fight just obliterated them, I was like, this team is clueless about what they need to do in these moments. And like, this team is not good together. They are not good for each other. Like, I think that is very clear. This team is not good for each other. I think Zeka's empowered if he has a strong jungler. If he has a really top tier jungler, he looks better. He's with Grizzly and he was with Klid, so shaky season. Viper needs a strong shot caller in his team. He tried to do it looked like in Worlds qualifiers, because he was talking a lot. Like, he was really communicating. But I think he needs, obviously, just a better team in general that he deserves. But I just felt like this team disappointed us early. We got some hope. Disappointed us again. We got some hope. Disappointed us again. And at the end, we were like, well, maybe they should be better than Dplus, right? Like, Dplus looked really weak at the end of the season. Nope, not better than Dplus. And they fall apart, and that's it. And Viper, he's probably going back to China. Let's be realistic with the salary caps and stuff coming. Because if he's not, and he wants to get money, then the rest of his team has to be bad, because there's not
or on existing contracts, or he goes to T1. Or somebody, just is willing to pay the luxury tax for him. I mean, that's totally an option, by the way. And Hanwha is a team that has quite a bit of money, so it's not outside of the realm of possibility that they might try and do something different. But this roster was just insanely badly GM'd by Hanwha. This is really disappointing given the amount of money that they spent. They shouldn't have been trying to buy Zeka and King and Hyde. Like, I would have rather there are so many different other options I think you could have pursued in terms of this roster creation, and Clid was clearly not it. It's not like Clid was coming off of a banger season from LPL either, so this was just really disappointing. I don't blame Grizzly, but basically Grizzly was a problem because the only thing he did was cross map from other junglers, right? He tried to avoid action early. That was the Hanwha game plan. And what this does is that it allowed teams to really start stacking a lot of early dragons because they just wouldn't contest the first two dragons or they would do it badly. And then you're forced into situations where you have to team fight everybody, all these teams that were playing against them around third and fourth Drake. And once people realized that they could do this to Hanwha, that there really just wasn't going to be any pushback early, it made it very easy. I think it made it very easy.
Made it really easy to put pressure on Viper every game because you saw
you
so
play
many
on bot side.
Yeah, you just play her on bottom side, and Grizzly was always like 15 seconds too late. Like he realizes, okay, all right, we've got vision that the enemy jungler's not top side. Kingan's pushing in a little bit. There's no pressure, and then he's just not there when the gank happens, and then he's like, "I'm here." Oh, Viper lost his sums.
Or he would do things like he would see the dragon go down in the Dplus series, which is playing Nocturne. Kenyon would recall to base, and Grizzly would be trying to counter jungle him on the opposite side of the map, but he would take so long doing it that Canyon would just recall, come back, and then come into the jungle, kill him, and then take Herald. And it's just like, at that point, it just hurts, man. It just hurts.
Yeah. I think Hanwha's preparation against KT was really bad as well. Like going into Dplus, it's hard to take a lot away from their 3-0 over DRX, except that they looked really good, but they didn't really show specific patterns that you really had to worry about, except obviously Showmaker picking up the Silas, which Chovy already showed, so that shouldn't have come as a big shock to anybody. But the preparation for Hanwha for KT by Hanwha was pretty bad, considering that KT looked super exposed in that series against T1, and then they just didn't change their drafting style against KT. Like, what did Hanwha do after getting eliminated from playoffs? Like, did they go take a workshop on the top of a mountain, like Korean companies do oftentimes, with like, we need to just bond together and like drink soju and try to get closer with each other? I think that's the real problem. I don't know what they did. I have no idea, but they did not prepare for these best of fives the same way their opposition did. And that's to me like the biggest issue. And is Zeka not figure out how to play other champions? Like, okay, that's fine, but can you get a strategy that empowers him? He also plays Silas. He doesn't have to play at Kali. You don't have to do that. You don't have to make those choices. If you guys can't figure out how to use him, why'd you buy him? And for Zeka, like, where's the growth, man? Where's the growth? Like, I think Zeka's a fantastic player, but like,
he needs coaches that are going to challenge him and expand his champion pool. He can't. I mean, he didn't change at all this year. Like, what did he do? Like, literally. For people out there who are these, I don't understand where these Zeka stands come from, by the way. It's fucking weird. But what did he do this year? Seriously, he learned Tristana. That's about all he learned, as far as I can tell. He had the Yone before, guys. He had the Yone before.
He had the Ari before, some of these other tech picks.
Yeah, he had the Ari before, but we mostly just saw the same old from Zeka, and that. And even I wish even some of these champs that he had played previously, he was better at. But he hasn't even improved on those champions. So it's been pretty disappointing, I would say.
Yeah, like he also is a pretty good Corki player. He wasn't willing to pull that one out. Like it's just, it's disappointing. And we know this roster isn't going to stay together. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but like we know, right? Like there's almost no chance this roster stays together. And I don't know if any of these players will go on. And I know Hanwha was one of the orgs that was pushing the most for, and even publicly so in the past, pushing for salary caps. It was kind of odd to me that they made this big spending push, kind of bombed, And now, like next year, I think they're probably going to go budget. Even though you were saying like technically they could keep Viper. He's has a relationship with the org. You played with him in 2019, but I think they're probably going to be like, "Whoa, we spent a lot of money. This didn't work. I definitely don't want to do this." And that's the thing about what we were talking about earlier about how teams can pay the tax and they can't exceed the salary cap. I just think based on the fact that these teams decided collectively to implement it, I don't think we'll see very few teams actually try to break it. So because the team isn't staying together, I hope that Zeka finds a new home where he can be impactful. I think Kingen is better served. The way he was used in this team was kind of sometimes they wanted him to be super aggressive and play hyper aggressive champs like he did in the Worlds Finals where he got MVP. But sometimes they wanted to play him weak side. I think he should always be a weak side focused guy with some tech picks like he has the Aatrox, the Camille he's pretty good at. His Gnar is very good. And just play him like teams play Dudu. Like Dudu's insanely good for Kwangdong, even though that team is, a bit of a tragedy. Like I'd like to see Kingen on a team that's stronger, where he could play like Doran or like Dudu, where it's like, all right, well, he's going to absorb some pressure, he's going to improve as a player in that niche, and like it's not going to be about him almost ever because Hanwha tried to make it about him and Zeka only, and then like left Viper on an island, and they're like, well, he'll scale, it's fine. Especially with Grizzly, they're like, yeah, well, Grizzly's not going to help you, so good luck. Life might roam, so hold those plates down there. I'd like to see Kingen on a team where he could be a little bit more of a facilitator. And Viper, I don't know if he'll ever be on a team, if he wants to make the money he was making this year in Korea that could support him, that is good enough for his standards. So I expect he's going to go to China, but this team is not good for each other. That's kind of my final thoughts. And I, like you said, GM'd badly, including like the PR around Khalid and everything that happened there, handled very badly. It was just kind of a disaster year for Hanwha, and yet they got so close to being at Worlds at least and couldn't even do that. So disappointment.
I'm glad to see them gone because they were just playing without any spirit at the end too. And the counterpoint to this is that Dplus ended up being quite a pleasant surprise. I thought Showmaker looked a lot better. He had been pretty shaky this year on the whole, but perhaps his motivation may have returned. He talked about having motivation issues earlier in the year, and I think that really showed in terms of his own effectiveness and the depth of his champion pool. But I thought he looked pretty good throughout the regional qualifiers. And, we got to see some of the stuff that makes this team fun, which is some dominant Canyon jungle performances, good pathing, good reads. Kellen, who's been in and out for Bible, I thought had some very good games in the best of 5 that they played against Hanwha.
Kellen's Alistair was actually out of control good, and it's been a pick he's played in the past and looked okay on. Like he's not a bad Alistair player, but we were pretty blown away by how well he played. Even interrupting shuffles twice in that series of the Azir, and just overall played really clean League of Legends, wasn't scared, was very confident. And sometimes when you swap players in and out, like Bible coming in for his, shot calling, supposedly, and then struggling in lane, it makes you frustrated as the bench player. You get motivated. You're like, I'm better than this guy. Like, what's going on? Like, I don't know if that's what happened with Kellen, but he clearly spent some of that time that he was on the bench really working hard, really grinding and putting in the hours to actually improve because he looked ready to go to Worlds. And it was a cool storyline, obviously, because Showmaker and Canyon have never missed Worlds since they came into the LCK, and they won't be missing it this year either. And that was the most positive surprise for me of this entire Worlds qualifier because I thought going into this, it's going to be Hanwha, probably. It might be Dplus, but if Hanwha loses to Dplus, it's going to be a messy series where we're not happy about anything. And at the end of the day, what actually happened is I'm pretty enthusiastic about Dplus.
Yep,
Like I actually think
I
they could. I think if they went to the upper bracket, they had a pretty good chance of beating KT. Like they looked better than KT, I think overall. And I'm suddenly thinking, especially when you consider how Dplus has been so good at new metas, that with the changes and the patches that will happen before Worlds, they'll have a really good read on that as well. They have a ton of extra time too before this World, so they could end up being our best performing team. Besides Gen.G, right? Because obviously Gen.G is the clear favorite of all of our teams and clearly the best. But like, I'm saying beyond Gen.G because I think there's a huge gap right now between Gen.G's performance we saw in playoffs and then the rest of the other teams, especially in that finals. So kind of excited about Dplus. Feel very good about Showmaker's current form. Will we maintain that? Hard to say, but with a lot of break time here, because that seems to be the issue for him is burnout. I think he should be in top form by the time we get to Worlds.
There's also not really a lot of point in grinding super hard right now because you're still a couple patches away from the actual Worlds patch. So until that hits live, I think many teams will probably. I mean, have you heard from teams? Are they going to take a short break after all of this? It seems like there's not a lot of point to practicing right now.
So because we're a few patches away, I think a lot of teams are going to be taking most teams take like a 2-week break to send everybody back to their families or whatever they want to do. You
Right,
know,
yeah,
so
yeah.
a lot of teams or a lot of players go on vacation for like a week. They'll travel to like Japan or go to, like Indonesia or whatever they want to do, like just go to the beach and chill during, while it's still good weather. And then go stay with their families for a week and then come back and start grinding with the team. A lot of teams and rosters, and you'll see this on like Instagram or whatever. A lot of rosters that are really close to each other will actually do like a team trip, the players together and go somewhere. It's happened a lot. Sometimes the team like sponsors that and sends them. Sometimes they do it on their own. Sometimes the players, will go like as a duo or whatever. But most teams, I think, are going to be taking about a 2-week break. Is the kind of the consensus I've been hearing. And then obviously some of the players participating in Asia games will be ramping up to that a lot sooner. But beyond that, I know for a fact a lot of teams are already sending players by players, piece by piece to start coming over here and boot camping. I think we'll probably see teams in a few weeks start scrimming the teams that are here for boot camps once they have their full rosters here. So it's going to be a really long build up to Worlds that I think in some ways benefits Korea because they're the home team, right? And they will be able to practice on solo queue, which is awkwardly like this weird thing where they go play in Champions queue in another region, and they're like, I'm actually getting worse from this practice. But I think it does benefit also the teams that come early for boot camp here, and because of a longer period of time, teams that invest in playing on the Korean server for longer and trying to get into scrims for longer will be able to grow quickly. But yeah, I going back to the original question, I think Showmaker will still have some decent time off before he has to get back on the grind.
Yeah. I just think like this is going to make a big difference for the Korean teams because they don't have to worry about the travel this time around and they can take a break, and there's not a huge point to practicing right now. But I also think Dplus is just the team that in a best of one in Swiss, I think they could beat absolutely anybody in a single game because it only takes one of those like weird canyon pop-off performances to completely dominate the enemy team. I don't know if this is the team that I think is going to like make a deep run at the World Championship. Like, are they going to make finals? I would say probably not. Like Kana, there were glimpses of what this team could be, I think, in regionals, which is that if Kana is weak siding, right? If they figure out their support problems, and if Deft can continue his really good performance that he's had all year, and Showmaker is actually back in some level to his former self, which he hasn't been for most of this year, then there's still the opportunity that this team could do very well. Like the ceiling of this team is obviously very high, but if you see a dip in Showmaker's performance again, or they fall into their kind of garbage shot calling rut, or they still are struggling at the support position, or they have to rely on Kana to carry, these are things that make you worried about Dplus.
Yeah, I completely agree. Deft looked very good in the regional qualifiers, so there's some hope there. I think the big takeaway for me for this Worlds qualifiers to last was last year I felt DRX they won the whole thing, right? But at the moment when DRX won, I was pretty disappointed because I was like, oh, I think Live Sandbox is better. I think KT is better. I think DRX had this lucky run. Both KT and Live Sandbox underperformed. And I walked away from the Worlds qualifiers going, well, we got 3 teams at Worlds and then DRX is over there. Now, everyone will like point for like, but like at that time, before they had their miracle run, they looked really weak. And
Yes.
And clearly there were underperformances from Prince in particular on Live Sandbox. And we were like, oh man, he was crying because he knew he had a bad series. It's not going to Worlds. This time I feel very good. about Dplus going. Like this time, I'm like, oh, nice. Like this team actually looks really good right now. Like this time, I'm like, oh wow, I'm pleasantly surprised. Like we got another strong team in here. I thought it was going to be like last year where I was just going, well, yeah, Dplus got a lot of issues, but they went, or oh, Hanwha went, but they've got serious problems with their prep, and Grizzlies too young, like are too new. Like can they actually go far? So I'm very. I feel like we're very lucky that Dplus suddenly showed up just as a region.
Yeah. So I was pleasantly surprised. It makes me feel better about the teams that are going because I think KT will be fine. You know, once Worlds rolls around, they were really consistent over the course of the split, and I think that now you're out of playoffs and you can kind of get some distance and look back at what happened versus T1. There were just some really obvious flaws that I don't think are going to be that difficult to fix, and probably just a break and some time separating that will allow you to diagnose them. Like, I don't think they're going to be as cocky coming into series at Worlds as it felt like they were in playoffs. Yeah, I don't think they're going to be doing a bunch of the weird stuff in the early game that really isn't their strong suit. You know, playing matchups very aggressively in bot lane at level 1 that they lose. Just very strange, very strange.
I think BD is the one that I trust the most in terms of his wide champion pool, his experience, because he's been around for a very long time. Like I think he won't be affected by the meta like we've seen Zeka, you know, obviously been affected by the meta. Showmaker has also sometimes been a little bit weaker in certain metas, but he usually comes around eventually. But BDD I trust will be very good. Cuz not 100% sure if I mean, the meta hasn't changed in jungle for a really long time, so maybe he will still just be able to play the standard meta champion, Sejuani the Maokai. His Lee Sin is like not very standout, you know, for example, if that becomes a thing. His Viego is fine. And then Keen, I'm you know, you and I were so high on Keen this entire year, and for good reason, especially in summer season. But it's not like he had a bad performance in playoffs, but he just didn't have the peak performances that we saw from him in the
The
past.
Rise
So,
performance was really good, and it was a great pick into the Gragas.
yeah, that was really cool. That was really niche. But otherwise, you know, I mean, his performance on that champ was also like pretty crazy, all things considered. But I do wonder if, like right now, if we have kind of average to high Keen, that's fine. But if we do get peak Keen back, you know, maybe that's
He'll be
the
back.
angle for KT.
Don't you worry. Don't you worry, Wolf. He'll be back. I think Keen was really cocky in the way he approached the Zeus matchup in the first series, but the second series was a lot better. And I think that we did see performances. I mean, he heavily bailed out game 4 when Lehen's like inted it at level 1. If he hadn't stepped up, that would have been, I think, a very, very different result, and the series would have been over sooner, right?
Yeah, agreed.
So.
T1 is one of those teams that is a very unknown quantity for me because before Faker, I mean Faker was injured for a while, right? Before Faker actually said, "I'm so injured, I'm taking a step away." There were issues in that team, and it seemed like the team wasn't getting along with each other in terms of how they were playing. That's just like, you know, conjecture based on what we saw in their play, like based on the way that they weren't playing together like they were in spring. They weren't coordinating big fights and big turns with the same caliber of control and oppression that we saw in the past, where it just seemed like you just can't beat this team. Even if they're out of position, they're just going to snap turn on you and kill you in a front to back super well. I feel like we didn't see that from T1 throughout a lot of the regular season. They brought it back a little bit when Faker returned. And after this loss, I don't know how they're going to take the loss. They probably won't take it too badly because they've been at like every finals for every tournament they've ever been in. So for this roster, so I think they'll probably be. I mean, yeah, they want to win the title, but I think they're like, okay, we got finals again. We performed really well. But how they bounce back with Faker recovering from his injury, Guma bouncing back, and he really needs to improve his champion pool, I think, against the best of the best. Because against, 80% of the LCK, it's fine. Yeah, you can play Zeri against those guys. But against the top teams, like, he seems a little shaky on the pick. If he can work on that, maybe T1 could surprise us and go all the way. I wasn't super high on T1 last year when they were at MSI. They surprised me and made it to the finals, and it was very close finals. I wasn't super high on T1 at the beginning of Worlds last year, but they also turned it around and had a great run. And I kind of feel similarly now where I'm like, yeah, well, They should be able to make knockouts 100%. I'm not worried about that at all. But how deep do they go is a question that we won't really have the answer to until we get there, until we see their form. But the one thing the known quantity of T1, and it's not Faker. He's going to say Faker. The known quantity of T1 is that these 5 players,
they choke.
That wasn't what I was going to say either. They choke in finals, but before the finals, okay, I'm just talking about in general. The known quantity is these 5 players go to finals. They perform well at international events. They are 5 players who have an incredible history of success at events like Worlds, like MSI, like Worlds and Pass, like LCK playoffs. So I know they have it in them to do well. We'll see what they do. It's kind of like, for me, I don't want to predict where T1's going right now because I don't know what those players are going to look like until we get to Worlds. Yes, they do choke in finals. You're right on that one. Yeah.
I do think that I am pleased with the teams that are getting sent. I was like you said earlier, I was a little suspicious about the 4th seed, but I was really glad to see at least Dplus step it up. Now, part of that was they played against DRX and like Hanwha, which looked like a lifeless corpse, right? But I'm hopeful. People will be excited to see this roster because it has Canyon and Showmaker and Deft on it, which is enough. The storylines are obviously going to be very good heading back in. And I like the fact that Deft will have the chance to eliminate his final previous world champion teammate in Pioshik at Worlds because he eliminated all of the other ones from Worlds contention so far. So I'm hoping we get to see the Liquid versus Dplus matchup. Maybe in an elimination match in Swiss or something like that. That would be
really cool. Yeah, that would be really cool. Deft is like, I was the one. I was the one doing the last dance. I was the one with the unbreakable
he's the Highlander.
Spirit.
There can be only one surviving member of DRX.
Or Barrel. We didn't really talk about DRX, but I don't really want to either.
Why would we spend our time doing that? So what were your thoughts about this season? Let's wrap up this season of LCK because this was a really exciting season in a lot of ways. There was a really tight race between Gen.G and KT that ended up really mattering in the final weeks of performance that put KT on top temporarily. Obviously, the injury to Faker will now be forever remembered because of how bad his team was without him, which just goes to show how incredibly valuable he is as a voice within the game when it comes to strategy and macro, even if his individual abilities are not the best. He's absolutely indispensable to this roster. And we also got to see, as shitty as his injury was, we got a really good playoff run out of T1 once he returned. And that was exciting. It made it for a much more exciting playoffs than could have been. Right. If he was still really hurt or couldn't play, this would have been a very lame playoffs, but instead it ended up being really, really, really compelling.
Yeah, I think we had a lot of really awesome stories in playoffs. I think playoffs was really fun. It was one of the more interesting ones where you just didn't necessarily know what was going to happen, whereas the past few playoffs have often felt kind of scripted, where you're like, well, it's these two, like we'll see you at the end. And then obviously KT versus T1 in spring was a bit of a, unexpected result where it was like, oh, that was close. That was weird for a second. Then KT were expected to beat Gen.G and then they didn't do it. Then Gen.G won the whole thing. Like that was kind of interesting, but I feel like we had several stories like that this summer. I think KT is really the big takeaway for me for the summer and for the year. If you look at the lineup, the roster, and you like list all the names, you're like Keen, trapped in Africa, now finding success, right? Cuz, very mediocre player for a lot of his career since the King Zone days. And then you're like, BDD, we saw his play on Nongshim last year, was not it. Aiming, nobody's high on this guy before this tournament. Lahen's okay, like, Lahen's, I'm like, okay, this guy's sick, like, we know this guy's amazing, right? But when we saw the KT roster, everyone was kind of like, could be like playoffs material maybe. That's kind of the vibe we had for this.
Well, I mean, aiming was very good towards the end of last year. Yeah, but he was the bright spot of that KT roster where they were struggling with mid lane and everything like that.
He also was like really good at Kai'Sa back then and Ezreal a little bit, and we were like, yeah, champion pool seems a little bit small, and he has really high highs, but his average was pretty mediocre, is what I would say. But yeah, he was the shining light on that team, and they had a lot of problems. But for me, like my takeaway with KT is if you put the right players together, this is like just proof that if you have the right players together and the right mentality, I think almost any roster can do anything as long as you have enough experience and you have the skill to back it up. And each one of these players came from like kind of a place of my team was struggling, minus Lehens, of course, and popped off this year and this season. And I think that was for me a kind of a touching story of like these players aren't washed. They still want it. They can still do it. You put the right combination of players together, and like anything is possible in the LCK. So that was one of the big takeaways for me. And then a lot of the hype for some of these challengers players, I think, is kind of deflated a little bit with what's going on with Kwangdong and Bulldog, right? And Grizzly is not really in this conversation because he like kind of suddenly like what got pushed up into this awkward position. I wasn't like being sent up normally, so I wouldn't put him in this conversation. But also we saw Yehu and Podok from DRX. Like the academy system is still not really being utilized correctly by teams, and like Duckdom got sent down for still nobody really fully understands because he's popping the fuck off in challengers. Like he's actually killing it every day in challengers. He looks way better than his counterpart on the DRX squad in Podok. No offense to Podok, but like DRX like, yeah, well, Podok did better in trials, so we picked him. I'm like, is that how this goes? Like that doesn't make sense. I'm still a little bit upset about how challengers is utilized. Dplus used Bible. They weren't willing to take the big risk and go in with Lucid like I was talking about before this qualifiers. You know, hey, it worked out. In the end, they looked very good. But next year, I'm hoping that if we do have a huge influx of challengers players, that they are coached early and brought in very early, because we've also seen challengers players here in the LCK get burnt out or fail in a big way under high pressure situations. Bulldog does not look like the same player he looked like in spring, for example. So coaching is really important. Hard to quantify, hard to see, hard to identify, but it's clearly making a huge impact in some of these series, like what we saw from Gen.G in the finals, what we saw or what we didn't see from Hanwha in these qualifiers and in playoffs. So doesn't matter. Like my main point here is doesn't matter who the player is and how good you think they are. It's how good how well you use them. Like Zeka Kingen, for example, how well you use them, how well you develop them is more important at the end of the day.
Well, since you've been doing a lot of the challenger stuff, are there any players and challengers that you think are going to have like really big years as rookies in LCK next year? Because people talk about like Lucid or Thanatos or these guys. So who are Wolf's predictions for breakout stars for 2024?
I mean, my main three are Thanatos and Lucid and Feisty. Feisty is a KT player, and he did play in that game, that one game where KT like subbed their challengers team in at the end of the regular season and won. Anyways, it was kind of a controversial thing, but I think he is super good. I think he's very, very strong player. Romer from Hanwha Life Esports is also very good. He's a little bit inconsistent. Like sometimes he's like I would compare him almost like how Showmaker is mostly really good, but during some periods are like, ooh, what's going on? Like he's having a bit of a off round here in this tournament. I think Romer is definitely a player we could see brought up, and I think he's very talented. That's like the main list. Duckdom, he's a great challengers player. Like I think he could definitely make a big splash. Like I think you guys could look forward to seeing Duckdom next year in LCK. Like I think he's very good. And like there's one player who I think I don't know if he'll be in LCK next year, but he's on Bro. His name is Kangin. I think he's very good. I think he got brought in very late into the season. Like he got signed, I think, in round 2 of summer season. But he is very good. He's a top laner, very, very good. Wide champion pool. He does weird stuff. Like he was playing Pantheon top. He's very mechanically gifted. And I think he's very smart. And even though Bro is like a not great team in challengers, if there are scouts looking at this guy, I think he definitely could get picked up. And maybe not in spring, but I think by summer, like people will be talking about this guy. I think he's insane. There's a lot of other really high potential players, but they're all too young to play in the LCK. So
fair enough. All right. Well, any closing thoughts on this year? I'm sure you'll be back on for SI or other shows during Worlds, so no need to worry. We may do some streaming. We'll see how it ends up with your World schedule and everything like that. Considering it'll be in Korea, and I will also be in Korea for Worlds, so we'll do some stuff.
We'll definitely do some stuff. I really enjoyed the year doing Monte Wolf with you, and I hope the LCK surprises me again in Worlds, and we actually end up getting another title. I hope they surprise me, because right now I'm a little bit worried, But we got top tier Gen.G. Okay, they look really good.
KT will win Worlds. Keen MVP.
KT on the rise. Please, LCK. Please. I would like one more Worlds title, please.
JDG in the trash can. Keen just dumping all over Ruler. Let's go. That's what I want to see. That's what I want to see. I think JDG will win Worlds, to be clear, but one can dream. One can dream.
I thought they were going to win last year too, but it didn't happen.
All right, guys. We are still going to be running Power Spike and Summoning Insight throughout Worlds. But as, of course, the Regional League ends, so do the Monte Wolf Show and Best Damn League Show. So there you go. We'll catch you again probably for some preview content for Korea starting in 2024. We'll see you then.